Silence had a shape in Millage, and it resided in Hal Mercer's corner booth at the Maple and Pine Diner. It wasn't an empty silence, but one thick with unspoken history, settling around him like the steam rising from the griddle each morning. At precisely 6:42 a.m., the bell above the door would offer its soft chime, announcing not just a customer, but the arrival of a town's quiet constant. Hal Mercer, a man etched with the lines of years and weathered by more than just the seasons, would enter frame slightly stooped, stride measured but unwavering. The air inside, thick with the comforting sense of maple syrup and warm eggs, embraced him, a familiar counterpoint to the hiss and sizzle from the kitchen. He never needed to scan the room. The corner booth by the window, bathed in the early morning light, was his unspoken reservation. Darlene, the diner's heart as much as its waitress, would spot him before a word was exchanged. "Morning, sugar," she'd call, already hefting the black coffee pot, her voice a warm melody against the diner's gentle hum. Hal would offer a curt nod, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips as he slid onto the worn vinyl seat. Beside the salt shaker, he'd place a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages holding secrets only he knew. His coat, faded and frayed, looking as though it held stories stitched into every threadbare seam, would be folded meticulously, just so, patch and all, before he slid in beside it. The jacket itself was a silent testament, a veteran of countless mornings and untold experiences. Once settled, Hal would unfold the Millage Weekly Tribune, give it a single decisive shake, and lay it across the table, a ritual performed with quiet solemnity. No one in Millage ever asked where Hal came from. His presence was simply accepted, woven into the fabric of the town's mornings. He arrived each day, clad in the same jacket, enveloped in the same profound silence. His routine possessed a rhythm as predictable as the jukebox cycling back to Sinatra at the exact same time every Monday. His order never varied. Buttermilk pancakes, no butter, accompanied by 2 slices of perfectly crisp bacon. And always, before the plate even touched the table, a neatly folded $3 bill would appear beneath the saucer. Eat. At 6:47 a.m., the diner door would swing open again, this time admitting a gust of cold air and the sharp clatter of a folder overflowing with printouts. Brandon Hale, young, ambitious, and perpetually rushed, would burst in, the bell above him ringing with a sharper, less welcoming tone. "Hey, hey, big week ahead, people," he'd announce to the room, breezing past 2 retirees engrossed in their omelets. Darlene would offer him a half smile, a non-committal nod, her movements fluid as she topped off Mr. Kessler's coffee without breaking stride. Brandon, making a beeline for the counter, would drop his folder with an emphatic thump. "Need a triple shot today, Darlene. You wouldn't believe how behind we are on these Veterans Day logistics." Darlene, pausing her work, would raise a knowing eyebrow. "How behind are you on manners, sweetheart?" she'd retort, her tone gentle but firm. Brandon would chuckle, turning to survey the room, his gaze inevitably landing on Hal's occupied booth. "Still got the throne, I see," he'd mutter, his voice carrying just enough to bridge the distance. "Must be nice to have a permanent table." Darlene wouldn't respond immediately. Instead, she carried Hal's breakfast across the room, setting it down with practiced, almost reverent care. Only then did she turn back towards Brandon, her voice low but clear. "That man once pulled my son Norman off Miller Street when a car jumped the curb. Broke his own wrist catching him. Never said a word about it. Just paid his tab and went home." Brandon blinked, caught mid-laugh, the information landing with unexpected weight. "Huh? Didn't know that." Darlene's gaze held his for a moment. "Lot of things you don't know, baby," she said softly, before returning to the counter. Undeterred, or perhaps spurred by a discomfort he didn't understand, Brandon wandered over to Hal's booth, arms crossed, folder pressed against his chest like a shield. Hal, engrossed in his newspaper, didn't look up. Brandon tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the worn jacket draped beside the older man. "That thing belong in a donation bin?" he asked, his tone attempting mock casualness. He gestured towards the patch, a faded triangle of ghostly blue, barely visible beneath a fold. Looks like it's seen too many winters. Hal calmly turned a page of his newspaper. The only sound from the booth was the soft, rhythmic ticking of his silver watch, a quiet counterpoint to the distant strains of Sinatra from the jukebox. Brandon chuckled again, a smugness now evident in his voice, undisguised. Better hope it doesn't fall apart before the parade. At the coffee machine, Darlene froze, her eyes lifting, not towards Brandon, but towards Hal. The newspaper in Hal's hands stilled, but he remained silent, his stillness more potent than any retort. The silence stretched, heavier than Brandon's ill-conceived joke. Feeling suddenly unsure, Brandon shifted his weight, tapped the table twice. Anyway, big week, I'll leave you to your rituals. He turned abruptly and headed for the door, his folder swinging against his hip. The bell gave its usual soft ring as the door eased shut behind him, leaving the diner's quiet rhythm momentarily disrupted, yet ultimately unchanged. The morning sun, finally breaking through the diner's fogged windows, slanted across the booth, warming the laminate tabletop and glinting off the brass napkin holders, momentarily illuminating the faded patch on the folded jacket. Hal Mercer never missed a Monday at Mosswood Park, just as the park benches never seemed to need asking who kept them clean. By 6:03 a.m., while mist still clung low along the tree line, pooling in the hollows between the bronze memorial statues and the winding gravel path, Hal was already there. The park was wrapped in pre-dawn silence, broken only by the quiet rasp of his gloved hand brushing fallen leaves from the curved wooden back of bench number 7-1 of the few originals not yet replaced by impersonal molded plastic. He carried a sturdy canvas tote bag, its contents predictable. Folded cloths, a battered thermos filled with something warm, and a small American flag, still stiff and crisp from its packaging. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his knees protesting quietly as he knelt before the weathered bronze plaque honoring Lieutenant Thomas Callahan. Using a clean handkerchief withdrawn from his pocket, he carefully wiped the thin film of morning dew from the metal, his fingers tracing the engraved name, polishing it gently. He noticed the flower vase beside the plaque was slightly askew, one of the marigolds having succumbed to the weekend wind. With quiet care, Hal replaced the fallen bloom, adjusted the miniature flag so it stood perfectly straight and centered, a small beacon of remembrance in the quiet park. The crunch of gravel behind him broke the stillness. Sir, this area's off limits until the city team finishes its layout." Brandon Hale's voice, sharp and officious, cut through the morning fog. He stood there, clipboard clutched like a badge of authority. "Isn't." Hal turned his head slowly, rising to his feet with the measured patience of a man who had weathered far louder commands and far greater disruptions. He didn't speak, offering only a small, acknowledging nod before gesturing towards the vase he had just tended. Brandon stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area with an air of importance. "We're taping off zones for the Veterans Day program chairs, folding stage, speakers. Legal says no non-credentialed volunteers until the setup is officially signed off. Liability, you understand." Hal still didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his canvas tote and retrieved a small, handmade wooden sign. On it, written in careful, blocky strokes, were two simple words. "Remember them." He gently pushed the sign stake into the soft earth beside the walkway. Brandon squinted at the sign. "Did you make that?" Before Hal could respond, a woman's voice called out from behind the nearby hedges. "He makes one every year." Tina Alvarez, the park's groundskeeper, emerged from between the trees, wrapped in a green field jacket 2 sizes too big, work gloves tucked into her back pocket. "And I leave it right where he puts it every time," she added, her gaze steady on Brandon. Brandon hesitated, flustered. It's non-standard." Tina tilted her head, unimpressed. "He's been here longer than your permit, Brandon." A flush crept up Brandon's neck as he shifted his clipboard. "Still, if it's not city-issued..." Tina walked past him, picking up a loose trash bag beside a bin. "So, issue it?" she said simply. Brandon turned back to Hal, but the older man had already moved on, now kneeling beside another plaque. This one bore the name Sergeant Diane M. Luring, 1960 to 1989. Hal was gently brushing pine needles from the engraved letters, his movements slow and respectful. As he leaned forward, his worn jacket pulled tight across his back, revealing the faded triangular patch once more, its stitching nearly worn smooth by time and touch. From a nearby bench, Mr. Ogden, bundled against the morning chill under two scarves, a paper cup of coffee clutched in his hand, raised a shaky hand in a quiet salute. He watched Hal with the steady reverence reserved for a familiar, cherished ritual. "That man's been doing this since before my oldest was born," Tina murmured to Brandon, her voice low. "Never asked for a thank you." Brandon crossed his arms, his attention snagged again by the jacket. "Still wearing that jacket, huh?" His voice rose slightly, clearly intended for Hal to hear. Tina narrowed her eyes but remained silent. "It's just an old jacket," Brandon added with a dismissive half snort, scribbling something onto his clipboard. Hal paused mid-wipe. He turned slightly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to the frayed edge of the patch on his sleeve. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled his collar higher, then stood. He nodded once to Mr. Ogden, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, and then walked towards the edge of the park without uttering a word, his canvas bag swinging gently at his side. Brandon bent down and picked up the handmade sign. He held it, staring at the uneven, heartfelt letters before shaking his head, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Tina stepped beside him. "You really don't know, do you?" she asked quietly. Brandon shrugged, oblivious. "Know what?" The folding chairs creaked under shifting weight. The brass band played a low, preparatory murmur. Everyone stood in respectful anticipation, except for one man, the man towards whom the general was now walking. A crisp November breeze cut through Mosswood Park like a quiet blade, ruffling the rows of small paper flags planted by middle schoolers along the pathways. The air was a mix of autumn scents, freshly raked leaves, damp earth, the faint tang of metal polish from the honor guard's rifles, and the old wood of the temporary stage. The honor guard themselves stood perfectly still, their polished shoes aligned like compass points, rifles held rigidly upright, embodying silent respect. It was Thursday, November 9th, and Millage was observing Veterans Day in its characteristic fashion. Small, earnest, and just a degree shy of perfectly coordinated. Brandon Hale stood at the podium, one hand gripping the microphone stand, the other nervously flipping through note cards. His tan sport coat seemed too light for the autumn chill and too new to inspire confidence. He had already stumbled once, mispronouncing Lieutenant Jabinski's name, and was visibly trying to regain his composure. "And now," he announced, his voice slightly strained, attempting to reset the ceremony's rhythm, "please join me in welcoming our guest of honor, retired General Alara Torrance, decorated veteran of the 101st Airborne, and recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Legion of Merit." Polite applause rippled through the assembled crowd, veterans and their spouses, local teachers, city staff members, and a scattering of curious teenagers huddled in hoodies. General Torrance emerged from a side path, flanked by two local ROTC cadets. She moved with an undeniable calm authority, her uniform coat adorned with insignia, her silver hair pulled back neatly in a single braid. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the crowd with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to reading the wind before a jump. She ascended the platform steps, gave Brandon a curt nod, and then paused. Mid-step, her gaze locked onto something or someone at the edge of the gathering, near the large oak tree. There, on a bench slightly apart from the others, sat Hal Mercer. His hands rested atop a cane he hadn't needed the day before. His familiar worn coat was zipped only halfway, the faded triangular patch just visible beneath his folded arms. His head was bowed slightly, his cap pulled low, not in disrespect, but in a posture of quiet, profound remembrance. The general didn't speak. To the surprise of everyone, she stepped deliberately off the riser. A wave of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. The band trailed off into silence. The very air seemed to tighten. General Torrance walked slowly, purposefully, across the damp grass, her boots making no sound. The only noises were the faint whisper of the breeze teasing the microphone cable and the single sharp flap of the flag overhead before it stilled again. She stopped directly in front of Hal Mercer's bench. She straightened her shoulders, drew herself up to her full height, and brought her right hand to her brow in a crisp, precise salute, the kind that resonated with authority and deep respect, needing no stage nor ceremony to validate its weight. Gasps echoed through the stunned crowd. A woman nearby clutched her husband's sleeve tightly. A teacher dropped her program, its pages scattering unnoticed on the grass. A young child, no older than 8, pointed and whispered loudly, "That's Mr. Hal." Brandon froze at the podium, his mouth opening and closing silently, his carefully prepared note card slipping forgotten from his hand like autumn leaves. The general held her salute for a moment longer than protocol dictated, her gaze fixed on Hal. Then she lowered her hand and spoke, her voice steady, carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "That patch," she said, her words resonating with significance, "was only given to 5 men. He's the last one standing." Silence, absolute and profound, spread outwards from the bench in a widening ring. A boy in the front row leaned towards his friend, whispering with newfound awe, "That's the guy from the diner." Hal didn't move immediately. For a long moment, he seemed as immutable as the bronze statues nearby, carved from the same quiet endurance. Then, slowly, he nodded once. He rose deliberately to his feet, using the cane for support, and returned the general's salute with equal precision, just as the mournful, piercing notes of a single trumpet began to play taps, echoing through the silent park. The corner booth at the Maple and Pine was empty the next morning, a sight unseen for years. But the jacket was there. Folded neatly on the laminate tabletop, resting beside a standard diner coffee receipt, lay Hal Mercer's worn coat. On the receipt, beneath the printed timestamp, was a name written in looping, familiar cursive. Hal Mercer. Brandon stepped into the diner with a hesitation he hadn't possessed the day before. The bell chimed its usual greeting, but the atmosphere inside was subdued, quieter, as if the building itself held its breath, listening. Outside, the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and the sidewalk glistened with the remnants of morning drizzle. Inside, the windows were gently fogged at the corners, yet no one seemed inclined to wipe them clear. Brandon didn't scan the room this time. His eyes went directly to the corner booth, Hal's booth. The vinyl seat cushion was smooth, unpressed. The napkin dispenser sat untouched. But there, where a plate of buttermilk pancakes usually rested, was the jacket. The faded triangular patch was fully exposed now, no longer hidden by folds or shadows. Next to the jacket and the signed receipt lay a napkin, folded twice. Brandon approached the booth slowly, carefully setting his messenger bag on the edge of the opposite bench. He sat down tentatively, like a man unsure how to occupy a space suddenly revealed as sacred. His gaze traced the familiar creases at the jacket's elbows, the threadbare wear at the cuffs. He lifted the folded napkin. Written in the same ink as the name on the receipts were just 5 words. "Some honors don't come with ceremony." Brandon exhaled slowly, leaning back against the booth, his arms crossed, the jacket still untouched before him. Darlene appeared at his side, carrying 2 mugs, one already steaming with coffee. She set one down in front of him. "Didn't think I'd see you here before 9, she said, her voice gentle. Brandon didn't look up immediately. Did he say anything before he left it?" Darlene shook her head. "Just asked if I'd keep his usual table for him. Didn't say much else? But then again," she added with a soft sigh, "he never did." Brandon nodded faintly, absorbing her words. How long have you known?" Darlene pulled up a chair from a nearby empty table and sat down opposite him. I don't know exactly what I knew, she admitted quietly. Just enough. Enough to trust the quiet. Brandon looked over at her, his brow furrowed in thought. You once said. You said he helped your son. Darlene nodded, her eyes softening with the memory. Norman was 6, just a little thing, running across Miller Street without looking. A car came out of nowhere, speeding. Hal moved so fast, caught Norman mid-step. He broke his own wrist doing it. Her voice grew thick with emotion. He wouldn't let me call an ambulance, didn't tell a soul, just smiled through the pain and said, "It's just a sprain." Brandon's fingers traced the edge of the folded napkin on the table. And you never told anyone? Darlene shrugged slightly. Wasn't my story to tell, was it? Just then, the front bell chimed again. Tina Alvarez entered, shaking droplets of drizzle from her navy work jacket. She glanced towards the corner booth, spotted them, and made her way over. Figured I'd find you two here, she said, sliding into the seat next to Darlene. Figured I might as well add my piece to the puzzle. Brandon gestured towards the jacket resting between them. Be my guest. Tina folded her hands on the table. 2 years ago, she began, a week before Christmas, we had that big ice storm, remember? Power went down all over, including at Mosswood Park. Couldn't get a maintenance crew out until Monday because of the roads. But Saturday morning, I went to check the damage, and every single headstone in the veterans section was cleared of ice and snow. Every pathway shoveled. Darlene smiled knowingly. You're saying, Hal? Tina nodded. He even relit the entrance lantern somehow. Must have used his own generator or something. Paid for the fuel himself, I guess. I only found out because I found a crumpled fuel receipt days later, tucked under a bench. Signed Mercer, night crew. Brandon stared at the faded patch on the jacket again, the weight of understanding settling heavily upon him. He was right there, he murmured, almost to himself. The whole time, every single day. Tina nodded again. He never left Brandon. He just didn't need a spotlight. As if on cue, the radio behind the counter shifted tracks, a slow, wistful tune from the 1940s filling the quiet diner, something swingy but subdued. Several of the older customers recognized it instantly. Heads nodded in time, feet tapped gently against the linoleum floor. Brandon reached out tentatively and touched the jacket. His hands moved carefully, as though handling something precious and fragile. He gently refolded the sleeves, brushed a few imaginary crumbs from the seat cushion beside it, and then stood up. Across the room, a young boy, no older than 7, sitting with his father, raised his hand and waved shyly. It was Norman Jr., Darlene's grandson, grinning, wearing a denim jacket adorned with 2 small American flag pins on the collar. Brandon blinked, momentarily taken aback, then offered a small, acknowledging nod in return. He turned back to the table, carefully picked up Hal's jacket, and held it against his chest. I need to find him, he said, his voice filled with newfound resolve. Millage's public library didn't boast a modern computer database, but it possessed something far more valuable. Maggie. The heavy oak door gave its familiar protesting squeal as Brandon stepped inside the stone-trimmed building, the air thick with the comforting scent of old paper and floor wax. Warmth enveloped him like a familiar quilt, a welcome contrast to the crisp, bright cold of the late afternoon sun, casting long, diagonal shadows across the tiled floor. He rubbed his hands together, the folded napkin from the diner still tucked safely in his coat pocket like a pressed flower. Maggie, the town's repository of history and keeper of secrets, sat behind the massive wooden reference desk. A half-completed crossword puzzle before her, beside a teacup that miraculously never left a stain on the polished wood. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat coil, and the small bronze owl pin on her lapel looked older than the card catalog behind her. Well, she said, without even looking up from her puzzle. Took you long enough? Brandon blinked, surprised. Excuse me? Maggie finally raised her eyes, a knowing glint in them. Figured you'd be in by noon at the latest. Man leaves a coat like that, and a riddle wrapped in a napkin. Someone's bound to come looking for answers. Brandon approached the desk slowly. How did you... Maggie smiled faintly. Darlene called. Said your face had the look of someone trying to read Braille with gloves on. A small, involuntary laugh escaped Brandon. Okay, fair enough. I'm looking for anything you might have on a Hal Mercer. Old newspaper articles, military records, town archives, anything. Maggie's smile widened, the kind unique to librarians privy to hidden stories, 1 part mischief, 2 parts deep satisfaction. I was in school with his sister, Clara, she confided. Knew the family? Quiet folks. Always were. Too quiet sometimes. She stood slowly, pushing her chair back. Come on, you won't find Harold Mercer on Google, but the truth's probably curled up sleeping in drawer 6BD. She led him down a narrow corridor lined with faded posters from long-forgotten literacy campaigns. They entered the archive room where dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of winter sunlight slanting through the tall windows, like powdered sugar suspended in the air. Maggie switched on the hulking microfiche reader with a practiced hand and expertly fed a reel onto the spindle. Start looking around 1972, she instructed. Southeast Asia operations. Blackout missions, mostly classified back then. Look for bylines from a reporter named Winslow. He was a local boy, but he made a point of following up on missing soldiers when no one else would. Brandon leaned towards the glowing screen, scrolling through grainy headlines and dense columns of text, his eyes slowly adjusting to the pale blue light. It was slow, meticulous work. The only sounds the rhythmic click of the scroll wheel and Maggie's quiet breathing beside him. Somewhere between page 47 and 53 of the reel, he paused, leaning closer. Here, he said, his voice hushed. I think this is it. Maggie leaned over his shoulder. The headline read, 5 rescued from nightfall drop zone. Hero remains unnamed. Beneath it, a single brief paragraph. Survivors report an unidentified airman navigated an improvised evacuation under total blackout conditions after the aircraft's pilot was killed instantly by enemy fire. The airman reportedly carried 2 wounded soldiers over 3 miles of treacherous, uneven terrain before reaching an emergency intercept point. Sources indicate the man wore a distinctive triangular insignia patch, not yet documented in formal military inventory. Maggie let out a low whistle. That's him, all right. That's Hal. Brandon leaned back, stunned. Why didn't anyone ever follow up? Why wasn't he named? Maggie sighed. Oh, they tried. Winslow tried, but Hal never answered the door. Later that afternoon, after more searching through Brittletown records, Brandon found an address associated with Hal Mercer listed under a post office box number for years. The house, a small, unassuming rental on the outskirts of town off Chestnut Street, stood behind a sagging wooden gate, its porch lacking a railing. The mailbox clattered empty when he opened it. Still, he knocked on the front door, waited, then knocked again. No answer. The curtains inside were drawn tight. He stepped back onto the cracked sidewalk, unsure what he had truly expected to find. A man in uniform standing at attention? A welcoming fire glowing through the window? A simple explanation? Looking for Hal? A voice called out from the neighboring yard. An older man, bundled in a thick coat despite the afternoon sun, leaning heavily on a cane, watched him from his porch post, peering over the top of rimless glasses. Yes, Brandon replied. Yes, I am. I'm Brandon Hale. I work with the city. The man nodded slowly. Name's Thomas. I've known Hal since '64. Good man. He paused. He won't be back today, son. Brandon stepped closer to the fence separating the yards. Do you know where he is, Mr. Thomas? Or when he might return? Thomas tapped the end of his cane thoughtfully on the wooden porch steps. Sunday, he said finally. 3 o'clock sharp. Veterans section up at Hillcrest Cemetery. Rain or shine, that's where he'll be. Brandon swallowed, the implications settling in. Every Sunday? Thomas nodded gravely. Every Sunday I can remember. As Brandon turned to leave, Mr. Thomas added one last thing, his voice quiet but firm. He's not hiding, son. He just doesn't need to be found. Brandon nodded, a lump forming in his throat, and walked back down the path towards his car, his breath curling white in the cooling air. Back at home, he sat at his kitchen table, pulled out his calendar, and with firm, deliberate strokes circled the upcoming Sunday. He won't walk alone this time, Brandon thought. At exactly 3 p.m. that Sunday, Hal was there, just as Mr. Thomas had said. He stood jacketless despite the chill, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on a particular headstone. Lieutenant Callahan's stone, worn smooth by decades of weather and remembrance, its engraving softened but still legible. Hal stood motionless, the autumn wind teasing at his shirt cuffs, a single white carnation held loosely in his right hand. The cemetery around him was peaceful, blanketed in a carpet of golden leaves that spiraled slowly down from the ancient trees, gathering in drifts at the corners of headstones like unspoken prayers. Brandon approached quietly, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path, careful not to intrude too abruptly on the solemn scene. Hal didn't turn. When Brandon reached his side, he didn't speak either, simply stood beside him, hands clasped respectfully in front, his own white carnation cradled in his palm. They stood together in shared silence for a long time, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a crow. Eventually, Hal bent down and carefully placed his flower at the base of the granite grave marker. Brandon mirrored the action, placing his bloom beside Hal's. The two white flowers leaned towards one another, stark and pure against the weathered stone. It was Hal who finally broke the silence. He was 23, he said, his voice rough but steady, carrying easily in the quiet air. Had a laugh that could crackle through radio static. He paused, lost in memory. Called me Cap, even though I was younger. Carried her photo tucked inside his helmet liner. Hal gestured vaguely towards the stone. Never asked who the woman was, always meant to. Brandon waited patiently, listening. I come here every year, Hal continued, turning then, just enough to meet Brandon's gaze fully. Because I can. His eyes held a depth of experience Brandon was only beginning to comprehend. Why are you here, Brandon? Brandon answered simply, honestly. Because I should have listened sooner. Hal didn't nod or frown. He didn't offer forgiveness or judgment, but significantly, he didn't walk away. That following week, the Millage High School auditorium buzzed with the restless, chaotic energy unique to teenagers gathered en masse. Rows of students shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic seats, fanning themselves with programs designed like playing cards. Teachers lined the back walls, arms crossed, maintaining a semblance of order, while parents dotted the aisles, looking either proud or slightly bewildered. A large banner stretched across the stage proclaimed, Career Day Voices Who Serve. Offstage, in the wings, Hal Mercer stood quietly, arms folded across his chest. He wore a simple charcoal sweater and plain slacks, no name tag identifying him. Brandon joined him, holding a folded letter in his hand. You sure about this, Hal? Brandon asked, his voice low. Hal replied without hesitation, his gaze steady. One condition. Brandon smiled, already knowing. No applause. Hal nodded once and walked towards the podium. As he stepped into the spotlight, the murmuring chatter in the auditorium gradually subsided. He adjusted the microphone slightly. I was asked to talk about service, he began, his voice clear, carrying easily without needing to be loud. Not all service requires a uniform. Sometimes service is doing the quiet job, the necessary job, especially when no one is looking. He paused, letting the stillness settle over the young audience. When I was 19, he continued, I carried a man 3 miles through pitch-black jungle. He was wounded badly, couldn't walk. He told me over and over, don't stop, keep walking. So I listened, and I kept walking. I never forgot it. He looked out at the sea of faces before him, young, unlined, full of potential and uncertainty. You'll be told many times in your life to speak up, to make your voice heard, and sometimes you absolutely should. But other times, he paused again, his gaze sweeping the room. Other times, the most important thing you can do is shut up, listen, and carry what needs to be carried. A profound hush fell over the auditorium, born not of confusion, but of a dawning, unexpected understanding. Brandon stepped forward then, unfolding the letter he held. "This is a message from General Alara Torrance," he announced. "She writes, 'The best heroes don't seek the spotlight or speak the loudest. They listen, they observe, they notice what's needed, and they simply do it, without asking for recognition or credit.' Hal Mercer reminds us all what service truly means." Near the back of the auditorium, a girl quietly wiped her eyes. A boy in an ROTC uniform sat noticeably straighter in his seat. A hand went up from the second row, a lanky student with earnest eyes behind thick glasses clutching a notebook. "What did the patch mean?" he asked, his voice clear in the silence. Hal looked directly at the student for a long moment before answering. "It meant I went where others wouldn't," he said simply. The room held its collective breath. No one clapped. No one needed to. Later that week, Brandon returned to the library. Maggie met him at the door, not with a question, but with a smile and a small brass key. "North display case," she said, gesturing towards the front of the library. "Left shelf." Inside the polished glass case, illuminated by a single focused overhead bulb, lay Hal Mercer's jacket, folded with meticulous care. The faded triangular patch faced outwards now, visible and honored. Beneath it, a small, newly etched brass plaque bore just 3 words. "He reminded us." Standing beside Brandon, looking up at the display, was Norman Jr., Darlene's grandson. He tugged at Brandon's sleeve. "Can I wear a jacket like his someday?" he asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Hal Mercer never needed applause. Perhaps that was precisely why his quiet, steadfast presence ultimately resonated more profoundly than any grand speech or public ceremony ever could. What some had dismissed as just an old jacket had become a powerful symbol for the town. A tangible reminder that true dignity, quiet courage, and selfless sacrifice rarely announce themselves with fanfare. Kindness doesn't always carry a banner, and genuine worth isn't measured by newness or polish. Sometimes it is the worn things, the weathered faces, the silent figures who consistently show up, who carry the most weight and teach the most enduring lessons. If Hal Mercer's story stays with you, perhaps it's because you too have known someone whose quiet actions spoke volumes, someone who taught more by simply being present than by ever speaking out. And perhaps, like Hal, we all have the chance, each and every day, to remind someone through our own quiet actions what true honor looks like. Yeah.